We're continuing to look at weighted voting. We're working our way towards a measure of power, which we'll call the Banzhaf Power Index. And to get there, we need to learn about a couple of ideas, the idea of coalitions and critical players. Let's review a bit. As I said, we're looking at a situation involving weighted voting. That is to say, each player has a certain number of votes. We did an example in which we saw that some of the players had no power despite having a vote. Now what we mean here by no power is simply their vote could never change the outcome. What we want to do is we want to begin to work out how to quantify this idea. Given a weighted voting system, we will develop a way to measure what fraction of the power each player has. Here's our example from the previous lecture. It involved a weighted voting system. There were 6 players. They had varying number of votes. For example, Hempstead number 1 and Hempstead number 2 each had weight 31. That is to say they had 31 votes. At the other end, the smallest players, player 5 and player 6, had 2 votes apiece. Now this table is showing you what fraction of the total votes each player had. And in another column, we're showing the fraction of total power. Well, remember we worked out that players 4, 5, and 6 were totally powerless, so they had 0% of the power. And the other 3 players had equal power, so that would be 1/3 or 33.3%. Notice that the fraction of total votes is not the same as the fraction of total power, and the most striking example of that is player 4, North Hempstead. Despite the fact that this player had 18.3% of the total votes, we saw that they had no power at all. 0% was their power. This is a reminder of the notations. The players are called player 1, player 2, etc. They'll be denoted by P1, P2, and so on. Remember our notation for indicating the weighted voting system. First we show the quota. Here it's 9 in this example. And then the weights of the players in order, starting with player 1. Now, when you take a vote, all the players who vote the same way on a motion are called a coalition. And every coalition is either a winning coalition or a losing coalition. Ask yourself, how do you determine if a coalition is a winning coalition? And the answer, I think you'll see, is that you compare the total number of votes in the coalition to the quota. And if the total number of votes in the coalition exceeds the quota, then it's a winning coalition, and otherwise it's a losing coalition. Now I want you to try out 3 examples here. Determine whether each coalition listed at bottom left is a winning coalition or a losing coalition. Let me ask that you actually pause and work this out, and then when you resume, I will tell you the answers. Well, here are the answers. 1, 4, 5, 6 is a losing coalition, and the other 2 are winning coalitions. 1, 4, 5, 6 means the coalition involving players 1, 4, 5, and 6. And when you figure out the total number of votes in that coalition, that is 56. However, the quota is 58. 56 is not good enough, and so that's a losing coalition. On the other hand, if you take coalition 1-3, meaning just player 1 and player 3 together, that's 59 votes that they control, and that's larger than the quota, and therefore this is a winning coalition. And then looking at 2, 3, and 5, that is to say the coalition consisting of those players, player 2, player 3, player 5, that has 61 votes, so that's also a winning coalition. All right, now that we know what a winning coalition is, we come to the idea of a critical player. A member of a winning coalition is said to be a critical player if that player's votes make the difference between winning and losing. In other words, if the effect of that player changing her vote while everybody else in the coalition and everybody else outside the coalition stays the same, changes the coalition from a winning coalition to a losing coalition, then we say that player is critical. So how are we going to figure this out in general? Well, we'll look at any given coalition, and if we ask if a player is critical, well, we'll take that player out. Then we'll recompute, see whether the total number of votes still exceeds the quota. If it does, then that player isn't critical. However, if you've gone below the quota, then that player is critical. Let's do some examples here. Now, as we do these examples, here's a nice little bit of notation. We'll denote critical players by underlining them. So what I want us to do is to look at those four coalitions at bottom left and determine the critical players. Let me work out the first two of them for you, and then as a little bit of a quiz, I'm going to ask you to work out the other two. So let's begin with 1-3. In other words, the coalition consisting of player 1 and player 3. Which players are critical in that coalition? Well, we know that there's no dictator, right? We know that a single player cannot determine the outcome. So if we remove either one of those players from that coalition, then it's no longer a winning coalition, and that means that each one of those players is critical. So in terms of notation, what you should do is underline both number 1 and number 3. All right, let's go on to the next one, the coalition consisting of players 2, 3, and 5. And that is, again, a winning coalition, and the total number of votes in that coalition is 61. It is 61. Now, what happens if we take out player 2? If we take out player 2, well, that will leave us with 30 votes, and that's not enough, so player 2 is critical. If we leave out player 3, we'll be left with player 2 and player 3. That will be 33 votes, and again, that's not enough, so player 3 is also critical. And then, considering player 5, well, if you take out player 5, there still will be 59 votes, and that's still a winning coalition, so player 5 is not critical. So to review, players 2 and 3 are critical, player 5 is not. In terms of notation, we should underline the 2 and the 3, but not underline the 5. Now, by the way, as we go through here and are underlining, it will always be the case that once you stop underlining, you don't start up again. That is to say, there will come some point where the underlining stops. It may be that everybody gets underlined, and it may be that nobody gets underlined. Otherwise, what will happen is some of the players up to a certain point get underlined, and then after that, they don't. And here's the next example. Here's the coalition consisting of players 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6. And I'd like you to figure out which ones are critical players. In fact, this is a little multiple choice quiz here. I'm offering you 6 answers, one of which is the correct answer, and the other ones are incorrect. And I want you to decide which one is the correct answer. Again, pause the video while you figure out the answer, and then we'll go over the answer. Okay, so I hope you've worked out the answer, and the correct answer happens to be that players 1 and 2 should be underlined, and the other players 4, 5, and 6 don't need to be underlined. So why is that? Well, let's consider first of all player number 1. When player 1 is in the coalition, the total number of votes is 87. You should verify that. So add up all the votes except those of player 3. You will get 87. If you remove player 1, that takes away 31 of those 87, leaving you with 56 votes. And 56 is not quite good enough. It's less than the quota. So that becomes a winning coalition if you remove player 1. Therefore, player 1 is critical and should be underlined. Now, exactly the same calculation applies to player 2 because player 2 has the same number of votes. So again, player 2 is critical. On the other hand, consider player number 4. Again, you start with 87 votes in the coalition. You take away the 21 for player number 4, and that leaves you with 66. And that's more than the quota, and therefore player 4 is not critical. Since player 4 is not critical, player 5 and player 6 can't be critical. Throwing them away only throws out 2 of the 87, leaving you with 85. So neither one of them is critical. So again, the correct answer is to underline 1 and 2. Those 2 players are critical, and the other 3 are not. And here's the last example. This is sometimes called the Grand Coalition, the coalition consisting of all the players. So everyone voting in favor. And I want you to decide which of these players is critical. Again, pause the video, figure that out, and then I'll review the answer with you. And the answer is that none of the players is critical. Nobody should be underlined. This is very typical of behavior in a grand coalition. If there's no dictator, you see removing one player doesn't change what happens. It doesn't matter which player it is, even the strongest player. If the strongest player defects and goes to the other side, it still doesn't matter. So, again, no one is critical. The correct answer is the one at the top with no underlining at all. So here's a review of that little exercise. We looked at 4 coalitions, determined the critical players, and the answers are the ones that I'm showing you over on the left.